The headquarters is gone now. Not gone in the sentimental way people say a thing is gone when the sign comes down and the memories remain. Gone in the colder way. First, Peoria lost the command center it had lived beside for generations when Caterpillar shifted its global headquarters to Deerfield in 2017. Then, Illinois lost even that when the company moved its global headquarters again, this time to Irving, Texas in 2022. The name stayed powerful. The yellow machines kept moving dirt on every continent, but the state that helped turn Caterpillar into an industrial empire was left staring at a harder truth. The company could still carry the symbol of American strength while slowly cutting itself loose from the place that made that symbol real. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. Caterpillar did not collapse, it did not become obsolete, it did not fade into nostalgia. In 2023, the company reported roughly $67.06 billion in sales and revenues and employed about 113,200 full-time people around the world, with roughly 62,400 of them outside the United States. This is not a story about a corporation that died. It is a story about a corporation that stayed enormously alive while the industrial world that raised it in Illinois was thinned out, restructured, dispersed, and told to accept that as progress. And that is what makes the silence heavier. Caterpillar was never just another manufacturer. Its machines helped build Hoover Dam. They supported the Allies during the Second World War. They helped construct more than 70,000 miles of highways across the United States. For decades, the company stood at the center of the great American belief that industry could be local, muscular, and civic at the same time. A company could build the modern world and still belong to a place. A city could make something so essential that the work itself became identity. Illinois believed that. Peoria believed that. East Peoria believed that. Whole families built their lives around that belief. Now the question is no longer whether Caterpillar mattered. It did. The question is how the tractor that helped build the modern world stopped needing the people and places that built it. How does a company rooted in foundries, assembly lines, skilled trades, river towns, and Midwestern industrial discipline become a global giant whose center of gravity drifts away from Illinois without ever really slowing down? How does a manufacturing powerhouse keep its profits, keep its prestige, keep its market dominance, and still leave behind the workers, neighborhoods, and industrial memory that once made it feel permanent? That answer is not hidden in one villain, one quarter, or one dramatic closing announcement. It lives in decades of decisions that looked rational from the top and ruinous from the ground. Because Illinois did not lose Caterpillar all at once, it lost it in stages. It lost it when global reach stopped being an extension of Illinois' strength and became a substitute for it. It lost it when automation preserved output but reduced the number of people needed to make a living from that output. It lost it when labor ceased to be treated as a partner in production and became a cost to be managed, pressured, and when necessary moved around the world. It lost it when profit stopped meaning shared prosperity and started meaning mobility for capital, flexibility for executives, and narrowing room for everyone else. By the time the headquarters left the state entirely, much of the deeper separation had already happened. The address changed late, the logic changed much earlier. And that is why this story reaches beyond one company and one state. Illinois did not just lose offices, it lost a piece of the old industrial contract, the belief that if a community built the skills, the discipline, the infrastructure, and the loyalty, the work would stay close enough to sustain the people who made it possible. Caterpillar helped prove that the modern corporation could keep the brand, keep the engineering, keep the global profits, and still hollow out the home that gave it power. To understand how that happened, we have to go back before the exits, before the relocations, before the silence hardened into fact, to the moment Illinois first became home to the machine that would one day teach the world how to move Earth. When the tracks came east, long before Illinois watched Caterpillar pull away in stages, it first watched the tracks arrive. Not as a corporate abstraction, not as a polished brand, as machinery, as weight, as a new kind of engine dragging itself into East Peoria at the edge of the river where steel, labor, and transportation could turn an idea into an industry. If the ending of this story is about distance, the beginning is about contact. About the moment a company still rooted in California found something in Illinois it could not ignore. An idle factory, a skilled workforce, and a geography built for scale. That turn east did not happen by accident. It happened because of Murray Baker, a Peoria businessman who knew Holt Manufacturing through his farm implement dealership and saw what the company needed before the company fully saw it itself. Holt wanted more room east of the Mississippi. Baker pointed it toward an available plant in East Peoria, helped negotiate the deal, and gave Holt access to a modern factory, skilled workers, and stronger links to Eastern steel and broader shipping routes. In early 1910, the first Caterpillar tractor rolled off the Holt production line there. That single machine mattered for more than output. It marked the moment Illinois stopped being adjacent to the story and became part of its foundation. A move like that can look technical from a distance. Closer up, it was something larger. Illinois offered the kind of industrial logic that makes a company feel anchored rather than merely located. River access, rail connections, Midwestern customers, a workforce already capable of heavy manufacturing. The ingredients were practical, but the effect was emotional too. Once the machines were being built there, East Peoria was no longer just a production site. It was becoming one of the places where the company's future would be decided, in steel, castings, and shift work, rather than in patents or sales talk. Baker understood something else that would matter even more. Tracks did not belong only in the field. He saw road building coming. He saw that the tracked tractor could be more than agricultural equipment if the company could prove it in public. That is why the old Caterpillar Trail matters. In 1916, Holt used East Peoria machinery to help build a 5-mile scenic highway near Peoria, not just as civic generosity, but as demonstration. The company wanted people to see that these machines could shape roads, not just pull harvest equipment. Illinois was not merely hosting production, it was helping rewrite the purpose of the product itself. That shift gave the region a deeper claim on what Caterpillar would become. The machine that had begun as an answer to soft soil and traction problems was being pushed toward a larger industrial destiny, and East Peoria helped force that evolution into the open. The company would later become synonymous with excavation, grading, road building, dams, mines, and war logistics. Those later associations were not born whole, they had to be imagined first. Illinois was one of the places where that imagination hardened into proof. The roads around Peoria were not Hoover Dam, and they were not the interstate system. Still, they were an early signal that this was no longer just a farm machine looking for customers. It was a track-type platform looking for a century to dominate. By the time Holt and C.L. Best finally merged in 1925 to create Caterpillar Tractor Company, the logic of Illinois was already embedded in the business. The former Holt plant in East Peoria became the company's largest manufacturing center after the merger in 1925, and Baker himself helped make the union possible, later serving as a vice president and original board member of the newly formed company. That matters because it changes how the later loss should be understood. Caterpillar did not simply place a logo in Illinois and later remove it. Illinois helped build the merged company's industrial center of gravity from the inside. It gave Caterpillar plant capacity, labor depth, strategic access, and one of the men who helped imagine the company into its modern form. The merger also did something quieter and just as important. It gave the new company enough combined strength to think beyond survival. Holt brought the famous Caterpillar name and larger factories. Best brought financial solidity, advanced tractor design, and the base of a strong dealer group. Once those pieces were fused, Caterpillar was no longer just a promising manufacturer with a useful product. It was becoming a system: factories, dealers, service, distribution, and machines built not only to sell, but to keep running in the hands of the customer. East Peoria did not just supply output to that system, it helped anchor its scale.
He saw
That
California's
is the
gold
part
rush
easy
creating
to miss when
opportunities
people
that
tell the
traditional
story too
methods couldn't
quickly.
handle.
Illinois did not inherit a finished giant. It helped turn a contested, evolving track-type tractor business into a company with mass, direction, and industrial confidence. The tracks came east before the icon fully existed. The place helped make the power. That is why the later separation cut so deep. You cannot understand what Illinois lost unless you first understand how much of Caterpillar's rise was built there in the first place. Even so, roots are not the same thing as destiny. A factory can give a company strength without yet proving what that strength is for. The machines had arrived, the manufacturing base was taking shape, the identity was beginning to harden. What remained unsettled was the scale of the future itself. Roads would widen the vision, dealers would widen the reach, pressure would widen the stakes. Before Caterpillar became the machine that helped build the modern world, it still had to prove that the tracked tractor belonged far beyond the farm. The tractor that built the century. A machine can begin in one world and end up claiming another. That was the turn Caterpillar made in Illinois. The tracks that had first solved a farm problem did not stay in the field for long. Once the merger was complete and East Peoria had become one of the company's industrial anchors, the question was no longer whether Caterpillar could build tractors. The harder question was whether those tractors could become the working backbone of a new century. Not just harvesting crops, but grading roads, hauling pipe, cutting through rock, and proving that a tracked machine could go wherever wheels, horses, and older assumptions gave up. The answer came fast. Soon after Caterpillar Tractor Company was formed in 1925, the company finished stitching together a global dealer network from the old Holt and Best organizations. That mattered for more than reach. It created a service culture that treated support as part of the product itself. Caterpillar dealers were focused on service from the beginning, and by 1928, air service was already available for parts delivery. That one detail says a great deal about what the company was becoming. The machine was no longer enough on its own. Caterpillar was building a promise around uptime, response, and the idea that if the equipment stopped, the company would move to meet the problem before the customer lost the job. That kind of support widened the meaning of the tractor. A farm implement can be sold. A century-building machine has to be trusted. Illinois was central to that trust because the state did not just offer plant capacity. It offered the ability to manufacture at scale for customers who were beginning to use tracked equipment in construction and road building as much as in agriculture. The company's first new product after the merger, the 20 track-type tractor introduced in 1927, arrived at the exact moment Caterpillar was learning how to speak to a broader industrial future. These were not just tractors for pulling through soft earth anymore. They were becoming the working bodies behind jobs too large, too rough, and too continuous for old methods to handle. Then came the Depression, the kind of moment that usually tells the truth about a manufacturer. Demand shrinks, customers delay purchases, credit tightens, projects die on paper. For weaker firms, that kind of pressure exposes the limits of the business. Caterpillar felt the shock of those years, but its own historical record makes something else clear. The company kept investing in products and technologies important to customers while the economy was collapsing. That choice did not look glamorous at the time. It looked disciplined. It meant that while others were trying to survive the present quarter, Caterpillar was still positioning itself for the jobs that would follow. In practical terms, it was learning how to turn hardship into advantage. In emotional terms, it was becoming the kind of company people believed could outlast almost anything. That belief hardened in the 1930s because the work itself grew larger. Caterpillar machines began work on the Golden Gate Bridge in 1933. By 1936, Hoover Dam was completed using Caterpillar equipment, and the company's historical archive points specifically to Caterpillar 60 track-type tractors hauling huge sections of pipe there in 1935. Another Caterpillar source notes that 12 Caterpillar 60 tractors were used to help build the dam. Those details matter because Hoover Dam was not a marketing slogan. It was a public demonstration of scale, difficulty, and relentless labor. A machine that could function there could be imagined almost anywhere. The yellow tractor was no longer merely useful. It was becoming symbolic. If America intended to reshape rivers, cut roads, or command terrain on a massive scale, Caterpillar increasingly looked like the equipment that belonged at the center of that ambition. Illinois felt the force of that transformation directly. Every major project strengthened more than just the brand. It strengthened the factories, the payrolls, the confidence, and the civic idea that work done in places like East Peoria was connected to national achievement. That connection is easy to cheapen in hindsight, but it was real. People in industrial towns did not just earn a wage from companies like Caterpillar, they attached meaning to them. They could look outward and see the machine in the world. They could point to roads, dams, grading jobs, and large earth-moving projects and understand that the labor in Illinois was not trapped inside a plant. It was materialized outside, in concrete, stone, steel, and altered land. The company helped shape that feeling on purpose. In 1931, Caterpillar adopted the first iteration of its iconic yellow color, introduced the Auto Patrol, the industry's first true motor grader, and produced its first diesel tractor model, the Caterpillar Diesel 60. Those were not separate developments. Together, they marked a company growing more visually recognizable, more technically confident, and more deeply tied to construction as the defining arena of its future. The machines were becoming easier to identify, easier to imagine at scale, and harder to confuse with anything smaller than the work of modern infrastructure itself. Once that shift took hold, the tractor stopped being only a product category. It became a platform for an entire industrial worldview. Track-type tractors, graders, diesel power, parts support, field service, these were not random strengths stacked side by side. They formed a system. The company could sell the machine, support the machine, repair the machine, and prove the machine under punishing conditions. That was the deeper reason Caterpillar's rise gathered so much force in these years. The equipment was strong. The structure around the equipment was stronger. A customer buying Caterpillar was not only buying iron, he was buying continuity. By then, Illinois was doing more than housing production. It was helping produce industrial confidence on a national scale. The state's workers were not yet watching a company drift away from them. They were helping create the version of Caterpillar that made drifting away possible decades later. Globally recognized, logistically disciplined, mechanically trusted, and increasingly inseparable from the largest construction efforts of the age. That was the triumph hidden inside the rise. The company was becoming powerful enough to matter almost everywhere. The danger, still too distant for most people to name, was that a company with that kind of reach might one day decide it no longer had to belong so completely to the place that helped build it. For the moment, none of that looked like danger. It looked like momentum. It looked like proof. It looked like a machine stepping out of the field and into history. A tracked tractor had become something larger than itself, and Illinois was right at the center of that ascent. The decades ahead would push that ascent even further, through Depression survival, wartime production, and the infrastructure boom that made Caterpillar feel less like a manufacturer than an industrial fact. If the rise already feels bigger than one company, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and comment with the first moment Caterpillar began to feel inevitable to you. The machine is gaining force, the stakes are widening, and Illinois is moving closer to the center of the story. War, roads, and the making of an empire.
Ben transformed that huge
The
wheel
factory
tractor
did not
by
go
adding
quiet
tracks,
when the country went to war. It got louder. Louder with shift changes, louder with iron, louder with the hard confidence of a company that had already learned how to survive the Depression and was now being asked to prove something even bigger. By the time the 1940s arrived, Caterpillar was no longer just a successful maker of track-type tractors. It had become one of those industrial names that seemed built for pressure.
That traditional methods
The company
couldn't
had
handle.
weathered the worst economic collapse in modern American history, kept investing in machinery customers needed, shifted more deeply into construction and road building, and emerged looking less like a regional manufacturer than a permanent part of American industrial power. That transformation had been earned the hard way. During the 1930s, Caterpillar machines were already proving themselves on projects large enough to change how the public understood the brand. Golden Gate Bridge work began with Caterpillar equipment in 1933. Hoover Dam was completed in 1936 with Caterpillar machinery involved in the excavation and hauling that made the project possible. Pennsylvania Turnpike construction began with Caterpillar machines in 1938. Those were not isolated wins, they were a chain of demonstrations. A machine that could work under those conditions did more than sell itself. It changed the scale of work people associated with the company. The tractor was no longer just useful, it was becoming inseparable from the physical remaking of the American landscape. Illinois stood inside that proof, not outside it. East Peoria and the wider Caterpillar footprint in the state were helping manufacture the machines that carried dirt, pipe, concrete, and expectation on the biggest jobs in the country. That matters because this was the phase when the bond between company and place stopped feeling temporary. Illinois was not just where Caterpillar happened to make equipment. It was becoming the industrial ground beneath a national reputation. The more the company proved itself under pressure, the more people in central Illinois could believe their own futures had been fused to something durable. Success did not feel speculative anymore. It felt embodied in steel, engines, foundries, and payroll. War hardened that relationship even further. Caterpillar's own history notes that from 1942 to 1945, the company operated 7 days a week, doubled its workforce, placed women in research, foundry, and assembly line jobs, and built approximately 51,000 track-type tractors for the military. Those machines went everywhere the war demanded movement and endurance. What had once been a business built around traction and construction was now supporting the United States and its allies on every continent except Antarctica. A company that had learned to endure economic catastrophe was now helping power military logistics on a global scale. Illinois factories were no longer just serving customers, they were feeding a war machine. That kind of work changes the meaning of a brand. It also changes the meaning of labor. War production does not allow a company to hide behind polished slogans. Machines either perform or they do not. Assembly either holds or it does not. The distance between a factory and the world narrows fast when the equipment being built can shape roads, clear obstacles, haul supplies, and make the movement of armies more possible. For Caterpillar, that period did more than expand production. It deepened trust. The company came out of the war not simply larger, but harder in reputation. It had been tested in conditions where failure would have been exposed immediately. Instead, the machines held, the factories expanded, and the company's place in the industrial hierarchy looked stronger than ever.
The post-war years carried that trust into civilian life. Soldiers returned, contractors expanded, states and federal planners looked at roads, suburbs, freight movement, and population growth and saw a country that needed to be physically rebuilt for the age of the automobile. Caterpillar was ready for that world because it had already become something more than a tractor maker. It had the machines, the diesel technology, the service culture, and the dealer structure to stay close to the work once the work spread outward. By the time President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, the stage had been set for the largest public works program in American history. To build the nearly 43,000 miles of highway authorized under that act, contractors used Caterpillar track-type tractors, scrapers, and motor graders. The roads that followed did not just connect cities, they confirmed what Caterpillar had become. If the nation intended to move fast, build wide, and cut through distance itself, the yellow machinery was going to be there.
That is the point where a company stops looking like a strong manufacturer and starts looking like an empire. Not because it owns territory in the old sense, but because its equipment becomes part of the physical logic of the age. Caterpillar machines were no longer tied to one category of work or one class of customer. They were in dams, roads, construction sites, and wartime supply systems. They were tied to movement, scale, and permanence. Illinois felt the upward force of that transformation directly. Every mile of road, every major job, every new reputation gain made Central Illinois feel less like a host community and more like the industrial center of almost untouchable. That is how civic dependence deepens, not through one hiring surge or one good decade, but through the repeated experience of watching the company prove itself again and again while the place around it organizes its life in response. Confidence grew out of that repetition, so did belief. It became easier to imagine that a company so essential, so tested, and so closely tied to the great material projects of the century would remain inseparable from the people who made it in Illinois. A bond like that can feel stronger each time it is reinforced. It can also become harder to examine. Because by the time a company has proven its legitimacy through depression, war, and national infrastructure, people stop asking whether the structure underneath that success might one day change. They see the reputation, they see the payroll, they see the roads and the dams and the long industrial horizon. What they do not always see is that the very scale making the company look permanent is also teaching it how to think beyond any single place. That shadow was still faint. For the moment, the rise looked clean. Caterpillar had survived what should have crushed it, proved itself where failure would have been obvious, and helped build the roads and structures that defined modern American power. Illinois had every reason to believe it stood at the center of something secure. The trouble with that kind of peak is not that it looks weak. The trouble is that it looks earned enough to stop people from asking what hidden freedoms success has already given the company that earned it. Soon enough, Caterpillar would no longer feel like a hard-tested industrial force still making its way upward. It would feel like the fixed center of an entire regional world. That was the moment when almost nobody wanted to imagine how exposed that world might already be. Peoria at full power. For a while, it must have felt impossible to imagine the company anywhere else. The name was on the machines were on the jobs, and the jobs seemed to be everywhere that post-war America was trying to prove itself. Roads, bridges, runways, dams, ports. The brand that had been forged through Depression survival and wartime production was no longer climbing toward prominence. It had arrived there. Caterpillar's own historical record describes its equipment helping support some of the world's biggest infrastructure projects, from Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge to countless miles of roads, including the United States interstate system. From central Illinois, that would have looked like permanence made visible. Peoria and East Peoria were not merely company towns in the usual sense. They were part of a full industrial ecosystem built around the confidence that Caterpillar would keep growing and that Illinois would grow with it. Headquarters sat in Peoria. Major manufacturing sat across the river in East Peoria. Engineers, foundry workers, assembly workers, managers, suppliers, dealers, truck drivers, and families lived inside the orbit of the yellow machine. By the early 1970s, Caterpillar itself described the period as one of remarkable growth, with sales surpassing $3 billion in 1973, reaching nearly $5 billion by 1975, and the company's global workforce exceeding 80,000 employees. Those are corporate numbers. In a place like Peoria, they translated into something more intimate. Neighborhoods staying full, paychecks moving through local stores, and an entire region learning to think of Caterpillar's scale as part of its own identity.
That was the height of the illusion and the reality at the same time. The illusion was that scale guaranteed loyalty. The reality was that scale gave Caterpillar options.
Traditional methods couldn't
For the
handle.
people living around the plants, those two things could easily feel like the same thing while times were good. A company this large, this respected, this entangled with American construction and industrial prestige looked rooted. It looked like the kind of institution that did not merely operate in a city, but belonged to it. That feeling was reinforced by every mile of road cut through earth, every machine shipped, every photograph of Caterpillar equipment towering over some new monument of concrete and steel. Success did not seem borrowed. It seemed structural. The company earned that confidence honestly. Caterpillar was not riding a hollow brand in those years. It was still innovating, still expanding its capabilities, still deepening the systems that made customers stay. The early 1970s saw Cat Reman take root in the United States, beginning what would become a major remanufacturing business. That matters because it reveals how complete Caterpillar's industrial presence had become at peak power. It was not just designing and building machines, it was building a full life cycle around them. Sale, service, parts, rebuild, return to work. A system that comprehensive makes a company look even more immovable from the place that houses so much of it. Seen from the factory floor or the neighborhoods around it, the arrangement could seem almost self-reinforcing. Caterpillar grew because Illinois gave it manufacturing depth, engineering talent, and a disciplined workforce. Illinois thrived because Caterpillar kept growing. That loop is powerful while it lasts. It creates a civic psychology that is hard to break because the evidence appears to support it every day. Machines leave the plant, more orders come in, the company gets larger, the place feels safer. Over time, people stop experiencing that pattern as contingent. They begin experiencing it as natural. That is when strength becomes dangerous, not because it stops being real, but because it becomes harder to question. Buried inside those same triumphant years was the first quiet signal that Peoria's hold on the future might not be as complete as it looked. Caterpillar formed its first overseas subsidiary in England in 1950, then opened its first overseas manufacturing facility in Colville, Leicestershire in 1951. At first glance, that looked sensible rather than ominous. Overseas customers existed, shipping was expensive, tariffs mattered. A growing company was expected to follow markets outward. Nothing about the move necessarily suggested betrayal. It looked like expansion. It looked like reach. It looked like one more proof that the company based in Peoria was becoming a global force. Yet hidden inside that logic was a more unsettling possibility. If Caterpillar could build successfully abroad once,
It could do so again. Geography had not been erased. Still, it was no longer sacred. That is why the peak years matter so much in a story like this. They're not merely the part where everything works, they're the part where success grows large enough to hide the beginning of a different kind of freedom. Caterpillar had become an empire of machines, service, and industrial credibility. Peoria stood at the center of that empire in culture, memory, and management. What fewer people could yet see was that the very processes making the company more powerful, global reach, larger systems, broader optionality, were also making it less dependent on any single place, even the place that helped make the rise possible. The company never looked stronger. That was precisely why almost nobody wanted to ask how vulnerable the old arrangement might already be. A crack does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it enters under the language of growth, efficiency, and opportunity. Peoria at full power was real. The pride was real. The jobs, the confidence, the sense that the future had been secured through steel and skill, all of that was real. So was the shift beginning underneath it. What looked like expansion would eventually change the meaning of home. What looked like a wider horizon would later become distance. The machine was still running at full strength. The deeper question was whether the place that built so much of it would still matter once the logic of global production fully took hold.
The logic changes. The warning signs were not loud at first. That is one reason they were so easy to mistake for progress. Peoria still looked powerful. East Peoria still looked essential. The company still looked like the fixed center of an industrial world that had every reason to keep turning in Illinois. Yet the logic underneath that world was beginning to change. What had once looked like rooted strength was slowly becoming something more mobile, more abstract, and less loyal to place than the people around Caterpillar wanted to believe. The same company that had grown by binding machines, service, and geography together was starting to discover that scale could loosen those ties just as easily as it had once reinforced them. The first sign had arrived decades earlier under the harmless language of expansion. Caterpillar formed its first overseas subsidiary in England in 1950, and that led to its first overseas manufacturing facility in Colville in 1951. At the time, that move could be explained cleanly enough. Europe needed equipment. Export barriers mattered. Shipping heavy machinery across oceans was expensive. A growing company was expected to move outward. Nothing about that decision had to feel like abandonment. It looked like confidence. It looked like reach. It looked like one more proof that the company centered in Illinois had become powerful enough to plant its flag elsewhere. The danger hidden inside it was simpler and more important. Once Caterpillar proved it could manufacture successfully beyond Illinois, the old assumption that Peoria and East Peoria were indispensable began to weaken, even if almost nobody wanted to admit it yet. The 1970s made that buried possibility much harder to ignore. Caterpillar was still dominant, still admired, and still operating with the confidence of a company that had spent decades on top. Yet the broader manufacturing environment was shifting around it. According to Assembly, the decade was defined by increased globalization, foreign competition, and new forms of automation ranging from computers to robots. Caterpillar kept investing heavily in research and plant modernization, opening what it called the most modern engine factory in the world at Mossville in 1974, expanding computerized testing and inspection, and introducing more advanced manufacturing systems in Illinois. Seen from the outside, that was proof of industrial strength. Seen more coldly, it was the beginning of a new equation. Productivity, flexibility, and technological control were becoming just as important to management as the old bond between plant and workforce. That mattered because modernization is never only about better machines. It also changes who is needed, how many are needed, and what kind of leverage labor still holds once management can produce more with fewer hands.
Caterpillar's own development work in East Peoria helped push robotic welding and automated systems forward, and later accounts describe how jobs once performed by large numbers of welders increasingly shifted toward robot operation and other reconfigured roles. The clean version of that story is efficiency. The harder version is that efficiency changes the emotional contract inside a factory town. A company once dependent on huge concentrations of skilled labor begins to see labor less as the core of its strength and more as one variable among many in a system that can be redesigned. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing dramatic had broken in public. Still, the old balance was already under pressure. Another force was pushing from outside. Komatsu and other overseas competitors were no longer distant names on the edge of the market. By the early 1980s, the global recession and inflation had turned Caterpillar's formerly comfortable position into an open target, with Komatsu emerging as the most important challenger. Strategy and Business notes that Caterpillar posted the first annual loss of its modern history in 1982, and in 1983 and 1984, the company was losing roughly $1 million a day. Academic work on Caterpillar and Komatsu describes the period as the moment when both companies rescaled and globalization became something more than overseas selling. It became a contest over where production should happen, how cost structures should be managed, and whether a company built in one national industrial system could keep competing against firms organized around another.
That pressure did not erase Caterpillar's strengths. It changed the meaning of them. The dealer network, service culture, engineering depth, and product reputation still gave the company enormous advantages.
California's gold rush
Management understood that.
Traditional
The
methods
problem
couldn't
was that
handle.
those strengths no longer automatically pointed back to Illinois. If customers cared most about reliability, parts, and support, then manufacturing itself could start to look relocatable so long as quality held. Once that realization settles in, the old civic logic begins to thin out. A company can still value research in one place, assembly in another, components somewhere else, and lower labor costs wherever it can find them. What once felt like a single industrial world starts breaking into functions. Design here, production there, identity everywhere, obligation nowhere strong enough to stop the drift. People closest to the machine could feel that shift before they could fully name it. A town built around heavy industry does not need a formal announcement to sense when the ground beneath it is changing. It shows up in the language of management, in the urgency around efficiency, in the way foreign production stops sounding supplemental and starts sounding strategic. It appears when automation is praised not merely for safety or quality, but what it does to cost and flexibility. It hardens when global competition becomes the justification for every internal change, even changes that weaken the place that made the company powerful in the first place. From the executive view, this was adaptation. From the shop floor, it increasingly looked like distance disguised as necessity. That is the deeper fracture running beneath these years. Caterpillar was not suddenly becoming a bad company, and Illinois was not suddenly becoming a weak one. The break was subtler than that. The company was learning to think like a global system, while the communities around it were still thinking like an industrial home. Those are not the same thing. One seeks flexibility, the other depends on commitment. One sees geography as a variable, the other experiences geography as fate. Once those two ways of seeing collide, labor peace grows thinner, local loyalty matters less, and every negotiation begins carrying a different kind of threat. The machine was still running, the name was still strong. The trouble was that the old bargain between Caterpillar and the people who built Caterpillar was already starting to come apart, and before long, that tension would stop hiding inside economics and turn into open war. If you can feel the bargain fraying, like the video, subscribe, and comment on where you think Caterpillar truly crossed the line.
The machines still looked powerful, but the logic underneath them was changing fast, and what comes after this is no longer tension, it is consequence for Illinois too. Breaking the bargain. The old deal did not collapse in silence, it broke in public. After decades in which Caterpillar and the United Auto Workers had lived inside a rough but workable arrangement, the early 1990s turned that coexistence into open conflict. The company wanted flexibility, control, and the freedom to run its operations on new global terms. The union wanted to preserve a model built on bargaining power, wages, work rules, and the belief that a company so deeply rooted in Illinois still owed something to the people who had made it strong. Once those positions hardened, the argument was no longer just about contract language. It was about who would decide the future of the work and whether Illinois labor still had any real claim on the company's direction. The legal break came first. Caterpillar's most recent collective bargaining agreement expired on November 30, 1991. Workers struck after rejecting the company's proposal, and the dispute quickly became more than a normal bargaining cycle. A federal court later summarized the situation plainly. The agreement expired, the union struck, and the strikers eventually returned to work without a contract. That sounds procedural on paper. In lived reality, it meant the framework that had governed labor peace at Caterpillar for years was gone, and nothing equally stable was replacing it. The company was no longer negotiating from within the old shared system. It was testing whether it could function beyond it.
The first strike revealed how much had already changed. It lasted roughly 5 months, 163 days in contemporary reporting, and it ended not in a negotiated breakthrough, but in retreat. The union went back after Caterpillar threatened to hire permanent replacements, while the company agreed to stop that process once workers returned under the terms of its final offer. Even at that early stage, the imbalance was hard to miss. A strike had once been labor's most serious weapon. Here, the strike exposed how much leverage management believed it now had. What the company was really proving was not only that it could withstand a walkout, it was proving that it could force the union back into the plants without giving the union what it had walked out to win. That was the first wound. The deeper damage came afterward. With no contract in place, the conflict did not end, it spread. Work-to-rule campaigns, selected walkouts, disciplinary actions, legal complaints, and a growing level of mutual bitterness turned the plants into something closer to occupied ground than ordinary workplaces. By the time the second major confrontation arrived in June of 1994, the labor relationship had already become what the Bureau of Labor Statistics later described as a prolonged dispute shaped by large numbers of unfair labor practice allegations and years of acrimony. Pressure was no longer episodic, it had become the atmosphere. The second strike was larger, colder, and more revealing. On June 20th and 21st, 1994, about 13,000 workers walked out, with roughly 7,000 leaving early in Peoria and Pontiac, and another 6,000 joining the next day. The union said it was striking to press the company over about 150 unfair labor practice allegations and to force movement on a contract. Caterpillar answered with a display of managerial resolve that cut to the center of the whole era. By October, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the company had reassigned around 5,000 white-collar employees to factory floors, hired about 1,200 new full-time employees, added roughly 2,500 temporary workers, and still had some 4,000 union members crossing the picket lines. The strike did not shut Caterpillar down. It showed how fully the company had prepared to operate around labor resistance. That detail matters more than any slogan shouted on a picket line. If a company can keep plants moving with managers, office workers, temporary labor, new hires, and line crossers, the old industrial bargain has already been gutted. The issue is no longer whether workers are angry enough to stop work. The issue is whether stopping work can still stop production. In the Caterpillar dispute, that answer was becoming brutally clear. Labor still had solidarity, courage, and endurance. Management had structure, planning, and a new willingness to treat the union not as a partner in production, but as an obstacle to a more flexible operating model. Scholar Victor Devenatz would later argue that despite the militancy of the membership, the broader dispute ultimately ended in a decisive union defeat. That is a scholarly formulation for something the towns around Peoria already understood in more human terms. The company decided it would rather break the relationship than bargain within it. The community paid for that decision almost immediately. Contemporary reporting captured the social damage in ways corporate language never could. Families split over whether to stay out or cross. Churches tried to mediate. Former allies stopped speaking. Local reporters described brothers-in-law refusing to see each other over Christmas, and a region left with a deep sense of anger and uncertainty. The longer the fight lasted, the less it resembled a contract dispute, and the more it resembled a civic fracture. That is what happens when a company so deeply embedded in one region stops arguing merely over wages and starts arguing over whether the people in that region should still have any power over where the work goes and how it is organized. Systems do not break in theory. They break through human loyalties, marriages, neighborhoods, and memory. By December of 1995, after 17 months, the union ended the strike. The Los Angeles Times reported that the walkout ended in a way that let Caterpillar impose its own terms on about 9,000 union workers. The same reporting emphasized that during the dispute, the company had managed to keep factories running by using managers, office workers, and line crossers, while many workers felt the company had discovered how replaceable union labor had become. That was the real settlement beneath any formal language. The company learned it could outlast the union. The union learned that the old weapons no longer worked the way they once had. Even when a later settlement finally arrived in 1998 and formally closed the dispute, the essential result was already fixed. The old bargain had been broken years earlier.
That is why these strikes matter so much in the story of Illinois. They were not simply labor history. They were the moment the company proved to itself that it could shrink the political and emotional power of its historic workforce and still keep the machine running. Once that happened, globalization, automation, and profit-driven relocation no longer had to remain distant strategic concepts. They could become operating reality. A workforce with less leverage is easier to bypass. A community with a broken labor front is easier to disappoint. A company that has already shown it can keep production moving through conflict is a company much freer to decide that future investment, future jobs, and future growth belong somewhere else. The strike ended. The pressure did not. What followed was not reconciliation. It was exodus. The exodus did not arrive in one clean motion. It came in waves, each one easier for the company to explain than for Illinois to absorb. A downturn here, a restructuring there, a layoff framed as temporary pressure, then another one, larger and harder to explain away. In late January of 2009, Caterpillar announced nearly 20,000 job cuts worldwide as the global recession crushed orders. 4 days later, Reuters reported another 2,110 layoffs, with more of those cuts hitting Illinois plants and nearly 1,600 concentrated in East Peoria and Aurora. That is how an exodus often begins in modern industry.
not with one final ceremony, but with a company learning that it can remove thousands of jobs from the place that made it powerful and still keep the brand intact. What made the shock so lasting was that the recession did not create the deeper pattern, it accelerated it. The economic crisis gave management cover, but the older logic was already in place. Preserve the company, preserve the margins, preserve the global system, and let Illinois absorb the human cost. The years that followed made that painfully clear. Even during the demand surge of 2018, Reuters reported that Caterpillar's big East Peoria assembly plant was running just one shift and only 4 days a week. The company could still ride a boom in orders while operating Central Illinois at a fraction of the old industrial intensity. The machine was not dead, the old scale was. That is why the closure language never fully captured what people around Peoria were living through. A factory does not have to be totally dark for a region to feel abandoned by its own industrial center. Sometimes the damage is harder to see because pieces remain. East Peoria still mattered. Caterpillar still had manufacturing in Illinois. On its current United States footprint page, the company identifies East Peoria as the single-source global location for large dozers. That surviving role matters, and it keeps the story from becoming a cartoon about total disappearance. Yet it also sharpens the real tragedy. Illinois was not left with nothing. It was left with remnants of greatness, after losing the old concentration of power that once made the region feel like the unquestioned center of the company's industrial world. The symbolic break became harder to deny in 2017. Caterpillar announced that its global headquarters would move from Peoria to Deerfield, Illinois, near Chicago. The company explained the move in business terms: proximity to O'Hare, major interstates, and commuter rail, along with better access to customers and dealers. On paper, it sounded practical. In emotional terms, it landed like a confession. Headquarters had remained the last great sign that Peoria still meant home, even after the work itself had been thinned, relocated, and reorganized. Once the executive center left town, the fiction that Caterpillar and Peoria still occupied the same future became harder to maintain. 5 years later, even Illinois lost that reduced claim. In June of 2022, Caterpillar announced that it would move its global headquarters again, this time from Deerfield to its existing office in Irving, Texas. The company described the change as a move into a location where senior leaders already worked and where global customers, dealers, and other businesses had easier access. That explanation was coherent. It was also cold. By then, the sequence was unmistakable. First, the jobs were dispersed, then the center of authority left Peoria, and finally, the state itself was no longer necessary as the company's formal home. A relationship that helped define Illinois manufacturing for nearly a century ended not with collapse, but with administrative clarity.
The residue of that separation still sits in the landscape. The Library of Congress caption of a photograph taken in 2019 notes that the former global headquarters building in Peoria remained in service a year after the move to Chicago, while Caterpillar had already scrapped plans for a new 3-tower office complex in the city. That image matters because it captures the strange afterlife of industrial retreat. The building is still there. The name still carries force. The city still contains the architecture of past confidence. Yet the future, once implied by that architecture, has been withdrawn. The place remains. The promise does not. Memory, of course, survives in safer forms. Caterpillar still operates a visitor center in Peoria where the company's history is displayed through simulators, exhibits, and monumental machines presented as heritage. That is not trivial. It means the story still has a public face in the city that helped make it. Yet there is a hard difference between preserving industrial memory and preserving industrial power. A visitor center can celebrate the machine.
It cannot restore the old civic arrangement that let generations of Illinois workers believe the making of those machines guaranteed a durable future close to home. By the time memory becomes one of the most visible surviving forms of presence, something larger has already moved on. So the exodus was not one departure. It was the accumulation of decisions that taught Caterpillar how to carry its identity away from the place that helped create it. Central Illinois kept some plants, some engineering, some legacy, some symbols, and some reasons for pride. What it lost was harder to replace: scale, certainty, leverage, and the feeling that one of the great industrial names in the modern world was still bound to the people and river towns that had built so much of it. The exits are easy to list: layoffs, reduced shifts, Deerfield, Irving. The meaning takes longer to face. Once a company can keep the machines, keep the profits, keep the brand, and still loosen its obligation to place, the real question is no longer what left. The real question is what that teaches about the country that allowed it. What Illinois lost and what America learned. The machine survived. That was the point. Caterpillar's corporate headquarters now sit in Irving, Texas, and in 2023, the company reported about $67.1 billion in sales and revenues, with roughly 113,200 full-time employees worldwide. The yellow machines still move earth, haul ore, cut roads, and dominate job sites across the planet. The company did not die with Peoria's old certainty. It outgrew it. That is what makes the loss harder to face. Illinois did not lose a broken company. It lost its claim on a thriving one. Even that truth needs one layer of precision, because the story is not total disappearance. When Caterpillar announced the move to Irving in 2022, it also said Illinois remained the largest concentration of Caterpillar employees anywhere in the world. On the company's current United States footprint page, East Peoria is still identified as the single-source global manufacturing location for large dozers. That matters. It means Illinois was not erased. It means something more unsettling. The state was reduced from industrial center to a strategic node inside a global system whose loyalty lies elsewhere. That distinction is the real wound. Illinois lost more than payroll. It lost centrality. It lost the old industrial confidence that came from knowing a place did not merely host production, but shaped the direction of the company itself. For generations, Peoria and the surrounding river towns could reasonably believe that Caterpillar's rise meant their own durability. The factories, foundries, engineering centers, and headquarters all seemed to point to the same conclusion. If you built the machines that helped build the modern world, the future would keep circling back through you. What Caterpillar ultimately proved is that modern corporations can keep the symbol, keep the profits, keep the engineering excellence, and still loosen the bond to the place that made those things possible in the first place. That lesson reaches far beyond one Illinois company town because the broader national pattern is impossible to miss. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the United States manufacturing employment reached an all-time peak of about 19.6 million in June of 1979. By June 2019, it had fallen to about 12.8 million, a decline of 6.7 million jobs, or roughly 35%. Just as telling, manufacturing employment fell in each of 5 recessions over those 4 decades, and after each drop, it never fully returned to its previous level. That is not one company's story. That is the shape of a national transformation. Caterpillar became one of the clearest expressions of that transformation because it showed how a company could adapt brilliantly to global capitalism while leaving its home region with the bill. It kept the brand strong, it kept the dealer network strong, it kept the product reputation strong. It remained, by its own description, the world's leading manufacturer of construction and mining equipment, off-highway diesel and natural gas engines, industrial gas turbines, and diesel-electric locomotives. What changed was not the company's power. What changed was the geography of obligation. The modern corporation did not have to stay rooted where it was forged, so long as markets, logistics, and shareholders rewarded mobility more than loyalty. That is one of the hardest American lessons buried in this story. Globalization did not simply move factories, it changed the meaning of place. Once management learns that products can be designed in one location, assembled in another, supported through a worldwide dealer network, and sold under a single powerful brand regardless of where the steel is welded, the old social contract starts to look optional from the executive floor, even if it still feels sacred on the shop floor. Illinois kept believing it was home. Caterpillar learned to think in systems, regions, margins, and strategic flexibility. One side was still attached to place, the other had become attached to optionality. Another lesson is even severer. Industrial ecosystems are easier to hollow out than rebuild. Once enough jobs leave, enough plants contract, enough skilled workers retire or scatter, and enough civic life reorganizes around the absence, the damage becomes structural. The question stops being whether a company might one day bring work back. The harder question becomes whether the old concentration of skill, routine, suppliers, and confidence even exists to receive it. Manufacturing employment data over the last 40 years make that national erosion visible in aggregate. The Caterpillar story shows what it feels like up close, where the decline is measured not only in jobs lost, but in a city's reduced sense of what it is for. So what did America learn? It learned that a corporation can remain iconic without remaining rooted. It learned that a place can build the machines that reshape the planet and still lose the power to hold the company that makes them. It learned that efficiency, globalization, automation, and shareholder discipline are not abstract forces when they move through real communities. They are choices translated into empty parking lots, thinner payrolls, reduced leverage, and a quieter local future. Caterpillar did not teach that lesson alone, but it taught it with unusual clarity because the company never stopped looking successful while Illinois kept absorbing the subtraction. That is the final image that lingers. The tractor that helped build the modern world still exists. The paint is still yellow. The logo still carries weight. Somewhere, a dozer still rolls out of East Peoria because even now, Illinois remains useful to the company in specific strategic ways. Yet the larger bond is gone. What once looked like permanence turned out to be conditional. What once looked like shared assent turned out to be shared only until the logic changed. Illinois did not merely lose factories, it lost the old belief that making something essential guaranteed you a place inside its future. The machine kept moving. The ground left behind learned what that movement was worth. Caterpillar still builds some of the most powerful machines on Earth. The yellow paint still means strength, the logo still carries authority, but Illinois learned the hard way that a company can keep the symbol, keep the profits, keep the prestige, and still leave the place that gave it power to live with the silence. That is the larger warning buried in this story. Modern industry does not always collapse when it fails. Sometimes it abandons home while it succeeds. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. The machines kept moving. Illinois was the ground left behind.